Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Theo and Ricardo, for inviting me and for all the support that you gave me in order for me to be here. I would like to discuss overall trends, overall patterns that I can see in the region related to social policy, hoping that I can give some food for thought for later discussions that we'll have during the rest of the day. I will focus on the tensions between social incorporation and segmentation that has characterized social policy in the region in the long decade that starts in 2000. So beyond differences, cross-national differences that we can see in Latin America, we can say that on the one hand, we have an amazing and intense statecraft going on, revolving around the social incorporation of people to social policy. And Diego Sánchez-Encochea, who's here too, and I address social incorporation as the capacity that the states have to secure well-being in a decommodified way. Of course, following on the work of Stig Anderson and Goff and Gould and so many others, we're in great company here. And this is important. I mean, the capacities, the state capacity to decommodify people's well-being is important for many reasons, among which we have the fact that at any given point in time, most people are either too young or too old or too sick or disabled to be part of the labor force. There are also people, mostly women, who are looking after these people, who are unable to commodify their labor force. So it's a key for them to secure well-being independently from the labor market. There's also economic cycles, which come and go, and their fluctuation, and with their fluctuation, so that formal participation in the labor market, and therefore people's individual capacity to purchase social services and social protection. There's the need for human capital that any market economy has, and the fact that this human capital, many people, if not most people, in many of these countries cannot purchase in the markets. Cannot afford to acquire privately, or that markets do not provide effectively. And last but not least, countries explicitly or implicitly establish a certain floor of social rights, which cannot be left up to market forces. So these are all reasons why it's key for countries to strengthen their capacity to secure well-being independently from the market. And of course, the other side of this coin is labor incorporation. So ideally, labor incorporation and social incorporation should go hand in hand to help people secure well-being. So we have, on the one hand, in the region, this intense process of expanding social incorporation, and on the other hand, as I will show in a moment, not necessarily less segmentation in the way people are incorporated. And by segmentation here, I mean a persistent hierarchical differentiation in whether and to what degree decommodification takes place across the population, right? And so the combination between social incorporation and segmentation, understanding the tensions between the two, becomes important to see trends in terms of social inequality. Now, how to address incorporation? I mean, and this becomes really important as the region enters a new economic cycle, an economic slowdown. The need and even the feasibility, the viability to make social policy less segmented and more inclusive may somewhat paradoxically increase as well. So, how to address incorporation? To approach Latin America's specific type of social incorporation, we can place social incorporation along a continuum between segmented decommodification on the one hand and universal incorporation on the other. Now, let me say that universalism as a desirable feature of social policy, as you probably know, has recently made it back to the political and academic debate, right? For 15 years, nobody talked about universalism, and suddenly universalism is in the post-2015 debate. The Global Health Organization is talking about universal coverage. The World Bank is saying that we should all be worried about universalizing social rights. And why is that? Why is universalism back into the agenda? Well, first, because, well, as Corpi and Palmer argued long ago, universal measures are more effective for redistribution than those only focused on the poor. They give way to class coalitions that nourish and guarantee quantity and quality of transfers and services. Also because poverty is quite a fluid category, and universal measures are better equipped to face various contingencies, while stand-alone targeted measures most often channel many resources to distinguish between the deserving poor, the undeserving poor, and the non-poor. Also because of social cohesion and the fact that, as Putman has argued, universal policies promote civic engagement to improve state capacity, to improve benefits, and to make states more responsive to people's needs. And last and not least, because of the growth of the middle class, which has grown by several millions and is expected to grow, by billions in the next 10 years. But this is a middle class that, as the Financial Times has argued, it's quite fragile, and these are people who can easily experience downward mobility if not supported by governments with transfers, but also with services that they cannot necessarily purchase in the market. So why universalism? Not just for altruistic reasons and for idealistic reasons, but for practical reasons that have to do with good governance, as recent mobilizations in Sao Paulo and in other parts of the region has shown. In this context, universalism as the opposite to segmented social incorporation is not about the Scandinavian trajectory. It's not about convincing Latin American elites to devote like over 50% of the country's GDP to social policy. So we are not going as wild as, we are not thinking that by some magic thing, elites and the upper middle class will agree to create a Scandinavian type of social policy. What we are talking about, and Diego in our work, and I'm trying to address here, is talk about universal and segmented incorporations as the outcome of the combination between coverage. We would have universal social, we would have universal policy outputs when we reach massive coverage of whatever benefits we are talking about, when we have generosity in quantity and quality, and when we have equity in benefits. So this would make for universal policy outputs. And the opposite would be segmented incorporation, when coverage is variable, when we have basic access in quantity and quality to transfers and services, and when we have inequity in benefits. So in this analysis, targeting can be put to the service of either type of policy output. So targeting plays a very important role of affirmative action measures under either type of output. And of course, as features of policy outputs, segmentation and universalism are analytical devices to assess the direction of change, to assess whether one region or one country or one community is going in one direction or another one, rather than as features that we would expect policies to have fully accomplished, right? And this is especially the case for the universal side of the coin, much more than for fragmentation, because of where the region comes from. And where we come from can be easily summarized as follows. I mean, we come from a history of social policy deeply intertwined with, import substitutions, with the import substitution model, under which full-time salaried workers were the main recipients of incorporation. Those who were incorporated, full-time salaried workers, mostly urban workers. Social incorporation was about them, and it wasn't about the majority of Latin Americans who were informal workers, self-employed, domestic workers, most women, right? Most women in the labor force, rural workers, and the unemployed. So those were left behind as outsiders. But also social incorporation was segmented among insiders, right? So it wasn't the same to be part of the military than to be a teacher, than to be a member of the judiciary, right? So insiders were also deeply segmented along occupational status. And when we moved to the 80s and 90s, so this was what Armando Barrientos referred to as a conservative regime, a truncated regime, or what Jeremy Sickins refers to as a workerist model of social policy. And of course, as Fernando Filgueira has shown, segmentation cut across countries, yet levels of exclusion varied because of different levels of informality, right? So we had exclusive countries, dual, stratified, universalistic, and so on and so forth. So there were important national variations, but all countries shared that social incorporation was mostly about full-time urban formal workers. In the 80s and 90s, with neoliberal reforms, segmentation was reshaped, and first because it downsized the domain of social incorporation, right? So much of people's well-being was then transferred to the market, right? Transferred to the realm of markets and to the realm of market rather than social incorporation. Secondly, neoliberal reforms reduced the proportion of the labor force with full social protection, right? And third, neoliberal reforms reached outsiders to the labor market with measures that incorporated the poor, even if temporary, and often with small and compensatory measures, right? So this is where Latin America was coming from when it started this new period of intense state-led social incorporation, roughly in the 2000s. So what has happened since then? First, there's been a major shift regarding one of the vertices of the triangle, right? Access. There's been a major shift regarding access. And the main thing that has happened is the massive incorporation of people through conditional cash transfers. These programs have been studied quite a lot. They are important for many, many reasons, and one of them is that they targeted children who were and still are overrepresented among the poor. They were mostly excluded as direct recipients of social policy under workerist social policy regimes, and unevenly reached under the pauperist model that followed. And they are also important because they seek to disrupt the intergenerational cycle of poverty, and to this purpose, they seek to link transfers and services. Now, in 1997, you can see Mexico and Brazil as having the two pioneer CCT programs, and 10 years later, they have spread all over the region and beyond, so much as to make it worth talking about a new era of social protection. as Vishnu Sridharan argues. And one striking feature of this program is its massive coverage. We are talking about millions of people, 130 million people, 1 every 4 Latin Americans, according to the World Bank, is nowadays receiving directly related to conditional cash transfers. And not only they are massive, but these are programs that are here to stay. And as Garay in her dissertation has recently argued, these programs have become a key instrument of electoral competition. So it's unlikely that they will go away. Now, the expansion of people's access to social policy was and is not limited to conditional cash transfers, because beyond conditional cash transfers, there were many reforms in healthcare and pensions, and this is just an illustration of the distribution of reforms that involved either the creation of non-contributory pensions, old age pensions, the expansion of existing non-contributory pensions, or the expansion of healthcare reforms as well. And as you can see, policy change across the board. And as the result of this, if we look at the working population with social insurance between 2000 and 2009, we can see an important improvement between from 55% to 66% of the working population had health, pensions, or both. Of course, this change partly reflects labor incorporation, right? Because during this decade, informality dropped roughly 11 points due to the economic boom, right? So we could say, well, this is not about social policy. This is just the labor market getting more formal. But if we look at domestic workers, look at what happened. I mean, 18%, the proportion of domestic workers with social insurance went from 27% to 44% during this period. I mean, and these are really among the most vulnerable workers in the entire economy. Something similar occurred with the self-employed and with people working in business with 5 workers or less, which are also the micro businesses with more, which are more vulnerable. And so you can see that the improvements in access to social insurance was remarkable among the most vulnerable working population. And therefore, it's not only showing improvements in the labor market per se. And in addition, we can see how non-contributory pensions improved coverage. This is the proportion of people 65 years of age or more who receive non-contributory pensions. Not all countries have data that helps disaggregating non-contributory and from contributory pensions, but 7 of them do. And among them, you can see the case of Bolivia, right, where contributory pensions play a very minor role as compared to non-contributory renta dignidad. So, in short, there's much going on regarding access. And so, I mean, and we can see the region coming out of this decade with definitely a much better incorporation of people to social policy. What's going on with generosity and equity? I mean, are improvements in terms of generosity and equity as important as they are regarding access? And responding this question is key to see whether we are reinforcing segmentation to some extent, using this increase in access to diminish segmentation or to reinforce segmentation. So first, the first thing that, that's important to underline is that the evolution of social spending brings overall good news. Between the 1990s and the present, social spending increased. These are ECLAC's data, as it did since the 2000, which is the solid blue bar. So almost 7%, 7-point increase in social in social spending, social public spending. This increase was, however, larger in transfers than it was in services. What's interesting is that when we look at the share of social spending that each sector has, participation in social spending in education has remained the same. 20% of total social spending goes to education. In healthcare, the participation of healthcare dropped 2 points from 22 to 20, and it increased those 2 points from 40 to 44 in terms of transfers. So one important thing about this is that, as Sridharan argues, one key aspect of conditional cash transfers is that they are immune from the attack of merely being handouts to the poor, right? Because people who receive money must make responsible choices regarding education and health care of their children, right? It calls attention that despite this massive access to CCTs, like we're talking about 130 million more people incorporated to transfers that are directly related to services, and yet we don't have much change in terms of services themselves. And this is one of the downsides of the expansion of CCTs, which has been much more rapidly regarding the transfers than regarding introducing the changes that make services be not only more than basic, but also those that are basic have enough quality so that the formation of human capital that these policies seek to deliver actually takes place. So this is quite a problem if we intend the poor to enter not just any service, but sound, robust, and hopefully equal services than those access to the non-poor. And this has been much less on the agenda than the actual delivering of transfers. And actually, delivering a transfer is much more important electorally than making the fights with several stakeholders, unions included, but also the private sector involved in state reform. So of course, like handling the transfer is the easiest part of the deal. So we don't see much action here. Of course, talking about the overall patterns for the region, we can see important cross-national variations. And last but not least, related to the generosity and equity of services, there has been little and slow adaptation to changing families and labor markets. Like if you look at this graph, the orange is the Latin American data, the average, and then here is Uruguay, and down here is Mexico. Female labor participation between 25 and 44 years of age has steadily increased since 1990, right? So meanwhile, the capacity of the state to acknowledge changing families and labor markets, and I think it's nicely summarized in this drawing, has been quite slow. So, in terms of services, there's been a very important expansion of part-time preschool services for children 5 and 4, only in very few cases for children 3 years of age, which speaks of important developments that, however, lack the generosity and equity needed to overcome segmentation, particularly in terms of working hours. So measures that reconcile work and family continue to be largely market and family-based, and the state has had very limited involvement in this. Until 1910, attempts at having national full-time programs were exceptional. I would mention the Chile Crece Contigo as the one example, interesting example that with a national scope between the first Bachelet administration. And in terms of transfers, so this is about services, but in terms of transfers, overall reforms expanded without shortening distances between those who are higher up and people who have minimum contributory benefits. So we have improved contributory and non-contributory benefits, but the distance between the two has not been touched. So this means that the region comes out of this long decade having hardly altered rather heterogeneous benefits among insiders, right? For example, between informal and formal workers, both of whom are now insiders, but who have an important gap in terms of benefits. So what's then the overall direction of change? If we were to make a balance, I mean, and this is not to bring bad news and to make anyone feel depressed here. I mean, we can still be very hopeful that, I mean, and this is, I mean, the problem is that behind statecraft around social policy, there are power relations and very complicated trade-offs between those that are brought inside the distribution game and those that were already inside. So understanding how this works may create larger degrees of freedom to increase universal social incorporation rather than segmented. And I can see how we can learn much from specific countries and specific policies that are making a difference in this regard. But overall, for the region as a whole, we can see a rather positive trend in terms of coverage, both for transfers and for services. We can see high cross-national variations for generosity in terms of transfers, and mostly resilience with some reform attempts in terms of services. Like reforms like the Brazilian and the Uruguayan have something to show regarding improvements in generosity, but we also see that it's very difficult to bring together to make the floor of benefits generous enough as to make reliance on the market unnecessary unless people really want to. So you can still see that most reforms help people get vaccinated, but if you need a transplant, I mean, and go see if you find, you know, somebody in New York from the family who can send remittances to pay the bill. I mean, that's the idea I'm trying to convey here. And in terms of equity, the balance is negative, totally negative. So the problem is, as Florencia Antilla says, is that the positive gains in terms of coverage may become a problem in terms of institutionalizing segmented incorporation. So the goods of having expanded coverage becomes a problem for overcoming segmentation. Or as Carlos Barba and Enrique Valencia argue, I mean, they compare Brazil and Mexico, and they show for healthcare reforms, and they show that Mexico is coming out of this decade reinforcing segmentation despite massive improvements in coverage, whereas Brazil may be showing a weakened segmentation. So their work is interesting to show, to fine-tune the cross-national differences that can tell us where there's been some progress in terms of generosity. So to wrap up, academic tasks to pursue a better understanding of of course this argument that I'm making is quite consistent with the wonderful work of Armando Barrientos on segmented social protection. Fernando Filgueira talks about narrow corporatism and restricted targeting as the two main obstacles to make incorporation less segmented and more universal. Carmen Miraglia and her team in Uruguay talks about reinforced dualism. And so there are several people trying to get at what. So it's not that originally, right? What I'm saying, I think there is enough academic work to support the notion that we are in the face of this tension between the good news and the not so good news, and questions regarding how to make the most out of the positive and cope with the negative that's coming out of this. So academic tasks to pursue a better understanding of social incorporation. First, I think we need to fine-tune a pool of indicators regarding generosity and equity that are suited for cross-national analysis. So we have good indicators regarding coverage that are useful for cross-national and even intranational analysis. But we need to have better indicators regarding the other two dimensions that Diego and I are proposing, generosity and equity as the other pillars of what we refer to as universal social incorporation. And so for transfers, there's work that uses per capita GDP, poverty line, and food basket, and addressing the understanding how transfers relate to the food basket, for instance, is quite important to know, whether non-contributory transfers are suitable or not. The same regarding the poverty line, per capita GDP. Each of these indicators sheds light on different dimensions of generosity regarding transfers. And for equity, authors are using the difference between minimum and maximum transfers, the gap between contributory and non-contributory benefits, the minimum non-contributory and the average contributory, differences in adjustment mechanisms. These are all indicators that could help us have more systematic cross-national analysis of these dimensions, and the same with services. For healthcare, for example, measuring comprehensive versus restricted access to services, gaps between the insured and the people who have access through social insurance and through public sanitation. These are all examples of indicators that are out there, and some people are using them, but we don't really have a body of knowledge that systematically uses the same indicator for cross-national analysis in order to relate this to the reforms that were actually introduced, right, and show the correlation between this and that reform and the policy outcomes. Then the second question has to do with how much can policy design do to promote universal social incorporation? And what are acceptable levels of segmentation across sectors? Is it the same that the child dies because he or she lacks a transplant as to, for example, be unable to access secondary education? What are the normative implications of degrees of segmentation in one sector versus another sector? This, of course, brings complicated normative, ethical, and also political questions that have to be answered. And of course, what are the policy processes that encourage less rather than more segmentation? And this, as the economy slows down in the region, become all the more relevant because, as Fernando Filgueira in his work so forcefully argues, the coalitions that are behind most progressive governments in the region are made of the newcomers, the new insiders, but also the former insiders, and they have very different interests in terms of the policies that would involve progress for them in terms of their social incorporation, right? So are people incorporated through social insurance willing to give up some of their privileges, in their maximum benefits in order for redistribution to take place in the minimums, in the minimum access? These are questions that are important in order to make many of these reforms sustainable as the economy slows down and the redistributive game becomes more complicated. So I'm sure that lots of what we'll discuss today will help answer some of these questions, and I hope some of this, encourages the debate. Thank you.
Thank you.